A simple accountant at a children's cancer charity never thought his theft of $2,940,000 from sick kids would lead to the death of his own niece. What started as a small borrowing of $200 from a cancer patient's fund in 2002 grew into a systematic scheme that destroyed lives. For 13 years, David Mitchell believed he was untouchable, stealing from families desperate to save their children. He calculated every move, planned his escape, and prepared for a new life. But fate had other plans. Every morning, David would wake up at 6:30 to the sound of his old alarm clock. He would shower, dress in one of his 3 work shirts, and prepare a simple breakfast of toast and instant coffee. By 7:15, he was walking to his old Honda Civic in the parking lot behind his apartment building, carrying his lunch in a brown paper bag and a thermos of coffee that would last him until noon. The commute to downtown Chicago took 30 to 45 minutes depending on traffic, during which he listened to talk radio or old music cassettes on the car's aging stereo system. David earned $34,000 a year, which was enough to cover his rent, utilities, groceries, and transportation, but left little room for luxuries. His apartment was furnished with items from secondhand stores and garage sales. A worn couch he had bought for $50, a small television that picked up only basic cable channels, and a kitchen table with one wobbly leg that he had fixed with a folded piece of cardboard. His social life was limited. David had few friends and spent most evenings alone, reading library books or watching reruns of old television shows. Weekends were often lonely affairs, with trips to the laundromat, grocery shopping, and long walks through the city when the weather was nice. He had tried dating occasionally, but his limited income and shy personality made it difficult to maintain relationships. David's job involved processing donations that arrived from across the country, managing individual family accounts, and ensuring that desperate parents received the money they needed to save their children's lives. Every day, he reviewed case files that contained heart-wrenching photographs of sick children, detailed medical records describing their diagnoses and treatment plans, and handwritten letters from parents begging for help to save their sons and daughters. The cases varied widely in scope and complexity. Some families needed a few $1,000s to cover insurance deductibles or transportation costs to specialized hospitals. Others required hundreds of thousands of dollars for experimental treatments, bone marrow transplants, or long-term care in pediatric oncology centers. David had learned to compartmentalize the emotional weight of his job, training himself to focus on the numbers, procedures, and administrative details rather than dwelling on the human tragedy behind each account. In March 2002, David was working late on a Tuesday afternoon, trying to clear a backlog of account reviews before the weekly staff meeting. The office was quiet, with most of his colleagues having left for the day. David enjoyed these peaceful hours when he could concentrate without interruption, working through spreadsheets and donation records with methodical precision. He was reviewing the Rodriguez family account when he noticed something that made him pause. The family needed exactly $15,000 for their daughter Emma's chemotherapy treatments. Emma Rodriguez was 7 years old and had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 6 months earlier. The case file included a photograph of a small girl with large brown eyes and a bright smile, taken before her illness had robbed her of her thick black hair. Emma's parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, both worked minimum-wage jobs at a local grocery store in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood. They had no health insurance that covered pediatric cancer treatments, and the cost of Emma's care had already pushed them to the brink of financial ruin. The family had applied to Children's Hope Foundation as a last resort, after exhausting their savings, borrowing money from relatives, and organizing small fundraising events in their community. David pulled up the donation tracking system on his computer and began scrolling through the individual contributions that had poured in for Emma's treatment. The response had been remarkable, with hundreds of small donations arriving from across Chicago and beyond. Elementary school children had sent $5 and $10 bills with handwritten notes saying they hoped Emma would get better soon. Local businesses had contributed amounts ranging from $50 to $500. Someone had organized a bake sale at a nearby church that raised $312. The generosity of strangers never ceased to amaze David. People who had never met the Rodriguez family, who would never know whether their contributions made a difference, had opened their wallets and their hearts to help a sick child. It was this aspect of his job that made the emotional challenges worthwhile, seeing how communities could come together to support families in crisis. As David tallied the final numbers, he discovered that the campaign had raised $15,200. He stared at the figure on his computer screen, checking and rechecking his calculations to make sure he hadn't made an error. He reviewed each donation entry individually, looking for duplicate transactions or data entry mistakes that might explain the discrepancy, but everything appeared to be legitimate and properly recorded. The extra $200 represented a genuine surplus. The community had simply been more generous than expected, with donors rounding up their contributions or adding a little extra just in case. It was a common occurrence in successful fundraising campaigns, but David had never paid much attention to these small overages before. As he sat contemplating the numbers, David's desk phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet office. He picked up the receiver and heard the familiar voice of Mike Hernandez from the IT department. Mike was calling to remind David about the $200 he had loaned him 3 weeks earlier for emergency car repairs. David's Honda Civic had broken down on a particularly cold February morning, leaving him stranded in the parking lot of a grocery store. The mechanic had diagnosed the problem as a failed water pump, which would cost $450 to replace. David's checking account at the time contained less than $300, leaving him short of the money needed for the repair. Mike had been sympathetic to David's predicament and had offered to lend him the additional money. It wasn't an unusual arrangement. Several colleagues at the foundation had helped each other out with small loans over the years. But Mike was now calling to say that he needed the money back by Friday because his own credit card payment was due over the weekend, and he was running short on cash. David assured Mike that he would have the money ready by Friday. But as he hung up the phone, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. A quick check of his online banking showed that his checking account contained exactly $67.38. His next paycheck wouldn't be deposited until the following Tuesday, which would be too late to help Mike with his credit card payment. David had already borrowed money from his sister Sarah twice in the past year, once when his refrigerator had broken down, and again when he had needed emergency dental work. Both times Sarah had been generous and understanding, but David was too embarrassed and proud to ask her for help again. He knew that Sarah and her husband Tom were saving money for a house down payment and Emily's future education expenses, and he didn't want to be a financial burden on his sister's family. The extra $200 in the Rodriguez account seemed to glow on his computer screen like a neon sign. David found himself staring at the number, his mind racing through the implications of what he was considering. Emma Rodriguez would receive her chemotherapy treatments whether David took the surplus or not. The family had already been notified that their fundraising goal had been reached, and they had expressed overwhelming gratitude for the community's support. Under normal circumstances, the excess $200 would be transferred to the foundation's general fund, where it would be used to cover administrative costs or help with future cases where fundraising fell short of the target amount. No individual family would be harmed if that money were to disappear into David's personal account instead. David spent the next hour wrestling with his conscience, unable to concentrate on any other work. He walked to the break room and made himself a cup of coffee, hoping that the caffeine would help clear his thoughts. He stood by the window looking out at the busy street below, watching pedestrians hurry past in the gathering dusk of the Chicago evening. He had never stolen anything in his life, not even as a child when the temptation to take candy from a store had been overwhelming. His parents had raised him to be honest and hardworking, instilling in him a strong moral code that had guided his decisions throughout his adult life. David had always prided himself on his integrity and his reputation as a trustworthy person. But the financial pressure he was facing felt crushing. $200 would solve his immediate problem with Mike, prevent an awkward conversation about his inability to repay the loan, and give him a small cushion for future emergencies. Emma Rodriguez would still get her treatment, her parents would still be grateful for the community's support, and no one would ever know that a small accounting adjustment had been made. David returned to his desk and sat staring at the computer screen for another 20 minutes. Finally, with trembling fingers, he opened the accounting software and navigated to the transaction entry screen. He created a new line item, labeling it as an administrative adjustment for duplicate processing. A vague but plausible description that would satisfy any casual review of the books. With 3 keystrokes, David transferred $200 from the Rodriguez family account to his personal checking account. The transaction was processed immediately, and the foundation's accounting system automatically updated all relevant balances and reports. David then processed the payment of $15,000 to Children's Memorial Hospital for Emma's chemotherapy treatments, ensuring that the family would receive the medical care they desperately needed. The paperwork was filed correctly in the appropriate folders. The books balanced perfectly without any discrepancies, and the electronic records showed no irregularities that would trigger an audit or investigation. To any outside observer, the Rodriguez account had been handled exactly according to standard procedures. As David prepared to leave the office that evening, he felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. The immediate financial crisis had been resolved, but he was also aware that he had crossed a line that he had never imagined crossing. He told himself that it was a one-time situation, an emergency measure that would never be repeated, and that no real harm had been done to anyone. That evening, David called his sister Sarah in Boston, as he did every day after work. The daily phone conversations with his sister had become the most important part of his routine, a connection to family and love that helped him cope with the loneliness and stress of his life in Chicago. Sarah Thompson was 6 years younger than David and worked as a third-grade teacher at an elementary school in Cambridge. She was everything that David admired: intelligent, compassionate, dedicated to helping others, and blessed with an optimistic outlook that had carried her through the tragedy of their parents' death. Sarah had married her college boyfriend Tom 3 years earlier, and they lived in a small house in Somerville with their 4-year-old daughter Emily. Emily was the absolute joy of David's life, a precocious and energetic child who reminded him of Sarah at the same age. During their phone conversations, Sarah would regale David with stories of Emily's latest adventures, her funny observations about the world, and her endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how airplanes stayed up in the air. On this particular evening, Sarah answered the phone with laughter bubbling in her voice. She immediately launched into an account of Emily's latest artistic endeavor, which had apparently taken place while Sarah was grading papers in the living room. Emily had discovered a bottle of purple tempera paint that had been left over from a school art project, and she had decided to create a mural on the kitchen cabinets. Sarah described how she had become suspicious when Emily had been unusually quiet for more than 10 minutes, a sure sign that mischief was afoot. When Sarah had gone to the kitchen to start preparing dinner, she had found Emily standing proudly in front of the lower cabinets, which were now decorated with dozens of small purple handprints and abstract designs that only a 4-year-old could have created. David found himself laughing genuinely for the first time all day, as Sarah described Emily's earnest explanation of her artistic vision and her disappointment that her mother didn't seem to appreciate the beauty of purple paint on white kitchen cabinets. David told Sarah that Emily was obviously a budding artist and that she should encourage such creative expression rather than worrying about the mess. Sarah replied with mock indignation that it was easy for David to be supportive of Emily's creativity when he didn't have to spend his evening with scrub brushes and cleaning solvents, trying to remove purple paint from kitchen surfaces. But her tone was affectionate, and David could hear the pride and love in her voice when she talked about her daughter's personality and independence. They continued talking for 40 minutes, covering Emily's adventures in preschool, Sarah's challenging but rewarding work with her third-grade students, and Tom's prospects for promotion at the engineering consulting firm where he worked. Sarah also asked about David's life, his work at the foundation, and whether he was meeting any interesting people or pursuing any hobbies. David found these conversations both comforting and painful. Sarah's voice reminded him of happier times when their family had been intact, when their parents had been alive to share in the joy of watching Emily grow up. But the calls also highlighted his isolation and the limited nature of his social life. He never had much news to share about his own experiences. No stories of romantic relationships or exciting weekend adventures. These daily conversations with Sarah were the emotional anchor of David's existence. She was the only family he had left since their parents had been killed in a car accident 6 years earlier, when Sarah was still in college and David was just beginning his career. Emily represented hope and innocence in David's world, a reminder that life could be joyful and full of possibilities despite the struggles and disappointments that seemed to define his adult experience. As David hung up the phone that evening, he felt the weight of what he had done settling more heavily on his conscience. The $200 from the Rodriguez account would allow him to repay Mike and avoid an embarrassing conversation about his financial difficulties. But it also meant that he had stolen money that was intended to help a sick child, even if that child would ultimately receive the treatment she needed. David tried to rationalize his actions by telling himself that no harm had been done, that Emma Rodriguez would get her chemotherapy regardless of his small accounting adjustment. But deep down, he knew that he had violated his own moral code and betrayed the trust that families like the Rodriguezes placed in the foundation. 3 months later, in June 2002, David was walking to work through Chicago's Loop District on a perfect summer morning when he noticed a red Ford F-150 XLT parked outside McCarthy Ford dealership. The truck was beautiful, with gleaming red paint, chrome bumpers, and an extended cab that would be perfect for weekend trips to visit Sarah and Emily in Boston. David stopped to admire the vehicle and noticed the price sticker in the window, $22,590. David currently drove a 1995 Honda Civic with 180,000 miles on the odometer. The car had no air conditioning, which made Chicago summers miserable, and the transmission made concerning grinding noises whenever he shifted gears. He had been saving money for a new car for 2 years, but his car fund contained only $3,200. At his current savings rate of about $50 per month, it would take another 4 years to afford even a used pickup truck. As David stood looking at the Ford F-150, he began doing calculations in his head. If he could find more donation accounts with small surpluses like the Rodriguez case, and if such opportunities presented themselves every few weeks, he could accumulate enough money to buy the truck within 6 months. The foundation processed hundreds of cases per year, and David had noticed that many fundraising campaigns raised slightly more than needed because donors preferred to give round numbers or added extra money just in case. That afternoon, David returned to his desk with renewed focus on finding opportunities. He didn't have to wait long. The Patterson family had been seeking $18,000 for their son Jimmy's bone marrow transplant. Jimmy was 9 years old and had been diagnosed with leukemia 4 months earlier. His parents had organized multiple fundraising events, including a golf tournament, a silent auction, and a series of dinner benefits at local restaurants. The campaign had been remarkably successful, raising $18,350. David reviewed the donation records and confirmed that the surplus was legitimate. The Patterson family had already been notified that their goal had been reached, and the bone marrow transplant was scheduled for the following week. The extra $350 would normally be added to the foundation's general fund. David created another administrative adjustment and transferred $350 to his personal savings account. He then processed the $18,000 payment to the hospital for Jimmy's transplant. The transaction was documented properly, and the books balanced without any irregularities. Over the following months, David found similar opportunities in 6 other family accounts. Each time he told himself that he wasn't really stealing because the families were receiving exactly what they needed for their children's treatments. The money he took was genuinely surplus, created by the generosity of donors who had given more than the specific amounts requested. By December 2002, David had accumulated $4,200 from 8 different accounts. Combined with his existing savings, he had enough money to make a down payment on the Ford F-150. He visited McCarthy Ford on a Saturday morning and negotiated a financing package that would allow him to drive the truck home that day. When David arrived at work the following Monday, driving his new red pickup truck, several co-workers commented on his good fortune. David had prepared for this moment and smoothly explained that his grandmother had recently passed away and left him a small inheritance. The lie came easily, and nobody questioned his story or asked for details about his fictional grandmother. David's supervisor, Margaret Chen, was particularly impressed by his recent work performance. She told him that his attention to detail had caught several legitimate accounting errors that could have cost the foundation thousands of dollars. Margaret said that David was becoming indispensable to the organization and that she was recommending him for promotion to senior accountant. The promotion would come with a $6,000 salary increase and additional responsibilities that would give him access to the foundation's largest family accounts. During 2003, David refined his methods and became more systematic about identifying opportunities. He learned to predict which campaigns were likely to exceed their fundraising goals, often focusing on cases involving photogenic children or families with compelling stories that attracted media attention and celebrity endorsements. He also discovered that wealthy donors frequently gave round numbers that were significantly higher than the specific amounts needed, creating natural surpluses that could be skimmed without detection. David never took more than a few $100s from any single account, and he was meticulous about ensuring that families received exactly what they needed for their children's treatments. In his increasingly twisted logic, he convinced himself that he wasn't stealing from sick children, but was simply correcting accounting errors created by overly generous donors. Every evening, David continued his daily phone calls with Sarah. She told him that Emily had started playing soccer in a local recreational league for 4-year-olds. Emily apparently had no talent for the sport, but loved running around the field and socializing with other children. Sarah said that Emily might become a marathon runner instead of a soccer star, since she seemed to have unlimited energy for running, but couldn't figure out what to do with the ball. David enjoyed these conversations immensely, and often found himself smiling while Sarah described Emily's latest adventures. The little girl was growing into a bright, curious child with strong opinions about everything from breakfast cereals to bedtime stories. Sarah said that Emily had inherited David's mathematical mind, as evidenced by her ability to negotiate complex trades involving toys, snacks, and television privileges. By the end of 2003, David had stolen $12,800. The money sat in a separate savings account at a different bank, earning modest interest while David wrestled with what to do with his ill-gotten wealth. He was terrified to spend large amounts for fear of raising suspicions, but the growing balance gave him a sense of financial security that he had never experienced. In 2004, David received his promotion to senior accountant, which gave him oversight of the foundation's largest and most complex cases. His new position also came with access to campaigns that involved hundreds of thousands of dollars, creating opportunities for larger theft while maintaining the same level of security. David's documentation skills had become so sophisticated that his theft was essentially invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for irregularities. The foundation was growing rapidly during this period, processing larger cases and attracting more media attention for its work. David's responsibilities expanded accordingly, and he became known throughout the Chicago nonprofit community as an expert in charitable accounting procedures. He was frequently invited to speak at conferences and workshops, sharing his knowledge about financial management and donor relations. The irony of being praised for his integrity while systematically stealing from sick children was not lost on David, but he had learned to compartmentalize his guilt. During working hours, he focused on being the best accountant possible, helping families navigate the complex process of fundraising for medical treatments. Only in the evenings, alone in his apartment, did he allow himself to think about the magnitude of his crimes. By 2005, David had stolen nearly $18,000. He decided to escalate his activities and began targeting larger opportunities. The Williams family needed $23,400 for their son Marcus's treatment at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis. Marcus was 6 years old and had been diagnosed with a rare form of brain cancer that required experimental surgery and intensive chemotherapy. The Williams campaign had attracted significant media attention, including features on local television news programs and support from several Chicago celebrities. By the time the fundraising period ended, donations had reached $24,200, creating a surplus of $800. David stared at the surplus for 3 days before making his decision. Instead of taking his usual $200 or $300, he transferred $400 to his personal account. The transaction was documented as a standard administrative fee, and Marcus Williams received his full treatment funding. David then waited nervously for any signs that his theft had been detected. Nothing happened. No audits were conducted, no questions were asked, and no suspicious glances were directed his way. David realized that his position and reputation provided him with almost complete protection from scrutiny. As long as families received their treatment money and the books balanced, nobody looked closely at the specific details of how surplus funds were handled. Over the following months, David increased his typical theft to between $400 and $600 per opportunity. The additional money allowed him to make significant improvements to his lifestyle. He moved to a larger apartment in a better neighborhood, upgraded his wardrobe, and began taking Sarah's family on expensive vacations. For Emily's 6th birthday, David surprised the family with a trip to Disney World in Orlando. He paid for flights, hotel accommodations, park tickets, and meals for the entire family. Emily was ecstatic about meeting Mickey Mouse and riding the various attractions, while Sarah and Tom were amazed by David's generosity. When Sarah asked how he could afford such expensive gifts on his accountant's salary, David mentioned his grandmother's inheritance again and claimed to have made some successful stock investments. Sarah said that David had always been good with money and that she and Tom should ask for his financial advice about saving for Emily's college education. David felt physically sick while watching Emily's excitement at the Magic Kingdom, knowing that his generosity was funded by money stolen from other sick children. But he also felt genuine pride in being able to give his niece such joy and create happy memories for his sister's family. The contradiction between his crimes and his love for his family became a central tension in David's increasingly complicated emotional life. By 2006, David had stolen over $35,000. His success at the foundation continued to grow, and he was promoted again to chief accountant with oversight of all financial operations. Margaret Chen had retired, and her replacement was Robert Hayes, a former corporate accountant who was more focused on big-picture strategy than detailed oversight of daily operations. Robert told David that he trusted his expertise completely and would give him significant autonomy in managing the foundation's financial systems. Robert said that David knew the organization better than anyone and should continue doing whatever he was doing to maintain such excellent results. This vote of confidence gave David even greater access to large accounts and reduced the likelihood that anyone would question his methods. David realized that his real limitation had been his own timidity rather than any external controls. With increased access and reduced oversight, he could steal much larger amounts while maintaining the same level of security. In late 2006, he took $5,000 from a campaign that had raised $95,000 for a 12-year-old girl who needed $78,000 for experimental brain tumor treatment. The theft represented his largest single crime to date, and it felt like crossing a psychological barrier. David was no longer skimming small accounting errors, but was systematically stealing substantial amounts of money from charitable donations. But the girl received her treatment, the foundation's books balanced perfectly, and nobody detected any irregularities. During his daily phone calls with Sarah, she told him that Emily had reached another milestone. The little girl had lost her first tooth and was engaged in complex negotiations with the tooth fairy about appropriate compensation rates. Emily had apparently researched the subject by polling her classmates and had determined that the standard rate of $1 per tooth was inadequate given current economic conditions. Sarah said that Emily had convinced Tom to agree to $2 per tooth plus a small sticker, demonstrating negotiation skills that suggested she would become a lawyer rather than an engineer like her father. David laughed at the story while feeling increasingly distant from the innocent happiness of his sister's family. David's theft accelerated dramatically through 2007 and 2008. The financial crisis that hit the country during this period actually helped conceal his activities, as everyone at the foundation was focused on survival rather than detailed accounting oversight. Donations decreased significantly, but David discovered that economic chaos provided better cover for his crimes. By the end of 2008, David had stolen $120,000. He had also begun serious research into offshore banking, international wire transfers, and countries with favorable tax policies for American expatriates. He told himself that this research was purely academic, but he was actually developing contingency plans in case his theft was ever discovered. The foundation hired additional staff during this period, including Jennifer Walsh, a recent college graduate who had majored in accounting and asked many detailed questions about procedures and documentation. Jennifer was eager to learn and showed particular interest in understanding how surplus funds were managed and distributed. When Jennifer asked about the coding systems used for surplus distributions, David calmly explained that these were standard procedures that had been established before he started working at the foundation. He said that Margaret Chen had developed the system years earlier and that it had worked effectively ever since. Jennifer accepted this explanation without further questions, but her presence made David more conscious of the need to maintain sophisticated documentation for his theft. By 2009, David had stolen $200,000. He had perfected his system and was regularly taking larger amounts from high-profile campaigns that attracted significant media attention and donor interest. The money accumulated in multiple savings accounts and conservative investment portfolios, as David was afraid to spend large amounts that might raise questions about his sudden wealth. During his conversations with Sarah, she told him that Emily was excelling academically in third grade. The 8-year-old was reading at a 5th grade level and constantly asked questions that challenged her teacher's knowledge. Sarah said they were considering having Emily tested for the gifted program, as she seemed bored with the regular curriculum. David felt genuine pride in Emily's intellectual development, while simultaneously feeling guilty about the source of his ability to contribute to her education and opportunities. He had secretly opened a college savings account for Emily and was making regular contributions using his stolen money. By 2010, David had stolen $310,000. He opened offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas, using shell corporations that he had established through online legal services. Managing his hidden wealth had become almost like a full-time job, requiring hours each week to coordinate multiple bank accounts, investment portfolios, and corporate entities. During one conversation with Sarah, she asked if he was seeing anyone romantically. She said that he never mentioned dating or meeting new people, and that she worried about him being lonely in Chicago. David told her that he was focused on advancing his career and didn't have time for serious relationships. Sarah replied that money and career success weren't everything, and that she and Tom had been broke but happy when they first got married. She said that David deserved to find someone special to share his life with. David ended the call more quickly than usual, overwhelmed by the gap between his sister's innocent advice and his criminal reality. By 2012, David had stolen $720,000. The amount represented more money than most people earned in a decade, but it also represented a point of no return. David could never repay such a sum without confessing his crimes, and confession meant prison, disgrace, and the destruction of his relationship with Sarah and Emily. David had become a respected figure in Chicago's nonprofit community during this period, frequently giving speeches at conferences about charitable accounting practices and donor stewardship. He was quoted in newspaper articles about effective fundraising strategies and was considered an expert in financial management for healthcare charities. The irony of being praised for his integrity while stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. David struggled with insomnia and had developed stress-related health problems, but he also felt trapped by his success and reputation. David began serious research into false identities and permanent relocation during this period. The Bahamas emerged as his preferred destination, offering proximity to the United States combined with banking privacy and legal protections for wealthy expatriates. He contacted document forgers, investigated real estate opportunities, and learned about international wire transfer procedures. In 2013, David made his boldest move yet. He took $15,000 from a single campaign, documenting the theft across multiple transactions as various administrative fees and processing costs. The campaign had raised $52,000 for a family that needed $45,000, and David's theft represented nearly 30% of the total surplus. Nothing happened. No investigations were launched, no questions were asked, and no audits were conducted. David realized that the foundation's financial controls were inadequate to detect sophisticated theft, especially from someone with his access, expertise, and reputation. During his calls with Sarah, she told him that Emily was taking advanced placement classes in high school and was considering studying medicine in college. Sarah said that Emily was particularly interested in pediatric oncology because she wanted to help children with cancer. She had been volunteering at Boston Children's Hospital and was inspired by the doctors and nurses who worked with young patients. David felt physically sick hearing about Emily's career aspirations. His beloved niece wanted to dedicate her life to helping the same children he was stealing from. The coincidence felt like cosmic justice or divine punishment for his crimes. By 2014, David had stolen over $1,100,000. He finalized his relocation plans and established a complete false identity as Robert Hayes, a retired businessman from Atlanta. The identity included college transcripts, employment history, tax returns, and even social media profiles that dated back several years. David purchased a luxury villa in Nassau and established the financial infrastructure to support his new life as a wealthy expatriate. He also began the delicate process of transferring his stolen money to offshore accounts without triggering banking regulations or government oversight. David's psychological state deteriorated significantly as his escape plans solidified. He had trouble concentrating at work, missed social cues and conversations with colleagues, and became increasingly isolated from normal human relationships. The daily calls with Sarah became his only connection to genuine emotion and authentic human interaction. When Sarah asked if he was okay because he seemed distant lately, David told her that he was dealing with some complicated work situations. Sarah said that he could talk to her about anything and reminded him that they had been through everything together since their parents died. David desperately wanted to confess everything, but couldn't find the words. In January 2015, David identified what would become his final opportunity. The foundation launched its largest campaign ever for an 8-year-old child from Boston who needed $1,300,000 for experimental brain cancer treatment at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. The campaign materials only referred to the patient as Patient ET to protect the family's privacy, which was standard practice for high-profile cases involving minors. The campaign was massive, with support from local television stations, professional athletes, and major corporations. The story had captured the public's imagination, and David estimated that fundraising would reach at least $1,500,000, creating a substantial surplus that would provide perfect cover for his escape. For 2 months, David prepared meticulously while the campaign for Patient ET exceeded all expectations. Local news stations provided daily updates on the fundraising progress, while corporate sponsors contributed large sums and individual donors from across the country sent money after seeing the story on social media. The child's identity remained protected throughout the campaign. David also made the painful decision to stop calling Sarah. This was perhaps the most difficult part of his plan, as these daily conversations had been his primary emotional anchor for over a decade. Sarah called repeatedly, leaving increasingly worried voicemails about his silence, but David couldn't bring himself to answer. In one particularly heartbreaking message, Sarah said that she was really worried because it had been 3 weeks since they had talked. She asked him to please call back and let her know that he was okay. David saved the message and listened to it repeatedly, torturing himself with the pain in his sister's voice, while using that pain to strengthen his resolve. By March 15th, the campaign for Patient ET had raised $1,847,000. The child needed exactly $1,300,000 for the treatment protocol. David had a surplus of $547,000 to work with, but he decided to take all $1,300,000, the entire treatment fund. This would be his final and most devastating theft. David worked through the night on March 17th, transferring money to offshore accounts and covering his tracks with sophisticated false documentation. The theft required dozens of individual transactions spread across multiple accounts and documented as various administrative expenses, processing fees, and operational costs. On March 18th, David submitted his resignation letter to Robert Hayes, citing a family medical emergency that required immediate relocation to care for an elderly relative. The letter was carefully crafted to discourage follow-up questions, while providing a plausible explanation for his sudden departure. Robert expressed disappointment about losing David, but said he understood that family obligations had to take priority. He asked if there was anything the foundation could do to help with the transition or to accommodate David's family situation. David thanked him for his understanding, but said that the situation required his immediate and full attention. On March 20th, David flew to Nassau as Robert Hayes. His villa had ocean views and he had $2,740,000. On March 28th, David called Sarah. Sarah said she had been calling him for months. Sarah said Emily had died yesterday from leukemia. They had applied to Children's Hope Foundation for $1,300,000 for treatment. The foundation raised the money, but their accountant stole it all. Emily was listed as Patient ET for privacy. David realized he had stolen his own niece's treatment money. Sarah asked if David knew who the accountant was since he worked at the same foundation. David hung up and blocked Sarah's number forever. He sat on his terrace, surrounded by stolen wealth, and finally understood the true cost of his choices.